We actually did it. We actually moved here. We moved to Barbados. We're currently staying at the Crane Resort. Barbados has a really low number of COVID cases. They've had a total of fewer than 300 total cases and only 7 deaths. The last case of community spread was back in May. And the way they've been able to keep those numbers so low and the community spread down to effectively 0 is they require everyone who comes in to quarantine. You also have to have a negative test within 3 days prior to arrival if you come from a high-risk country like the United States. Additionally, during your quarantine, you have to have a second test that comes back negative while you're on the island. Once the second test comes back negative, then you're free to go around the island. For your quarantine, you have to stay at an approved facility. Currently, we're at the Crane Resort, which is a very nice place to quarantine. When you arrive at the Crane, they give you a different colored wristband based off of your quarantine status. Blue means you have not yet completed your quarantine and your second test has not come back. With the blue wristband, you're limited to only be able to go to the historic pool, which is normally an adult-only pool, but during COVID, it is a family-friendly pool. Also, with the blue wristband, you can order room service and there's no additional fee for it. If you have a red wristband, it means it came back positive and you're quarantined to your room until you have a second negative test. If, however, your second test is negative, then you exchange your blue wristband for a green wristband. The green wristband allows you to go anywhere in the resort and it allows you to be able to go into any pool. When arriving from a high-risk country or having previously visited a high-risk country within the previous 21 days, like the United States, you need to have a negative COVID test within the previous 72 hours. It can take up to 72 hours to get those results back, which can cause some complications while traveling. Fortunately, the government of Barbados has a partnership with a company in the United States for those that are traveling to Barbados to be able to get testing at home and get the results in time for their travel. I would recommend this if you can afford it. Otherwise, check to see what the turnaround times are on your testing facility. If it takes longer than 72 hours to get your test back, that testing facility will not work. In fact, if it takes longer than the amount of time you have between 72 hours prior to arrival in Barbados and departure on your flight, then it may not work for you either. When you arrive on the island and you get off your plane, the first thing that you're sorted into are people who have taken a test recently and those who have not taken a test. Pretty much everyone on your flight will have taken a test. So you'll be funneled into another line where you'll have to show that you did take a test and that the results have come back negative. From there, you'll fill out immigration forms and you'll go through passport control. After going through passport control, you'll be funneled to another line where you'll wait to see a nurse who will talk to you through the guidelines for quarantine, as well as the following 7 to 14 days of temperature checks that you'll need to report to the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health will ask you to report temperature checks every day for the next 7 to 14 days that you're on the island for you and everyone traveling with you and your family. This is independent of your second test. You can take your second COVID test 4 to 5 days after you took your first COVID test prior to your arrival on Barbados. So that means if you took your first COVID test 3 days prior to arrival, you could take your follow-up COVID test as soon as 1 day after arrival. Test results take between 24 and 48 hours to return on the island, which means that if you take your first test prior to leaving 3 days prior to arrival in Barbados, then that means that you can take your second test 1 day after arrival. And then 1 day after that, you should have the results back. It may take 2 days. But this means that your quarantine stay could be as short as 2 to 3 days. You'll still need to complete the temperature checks every day for the following 7 to 14 days, depending on the direction of the Ministry of Health. What's great about this is it can drastically shorten the amount of time you're spending in quarantine. And since hotels here can be rather expensive and food options can be limited while you're in quarantine, that can really free up some funds. Today is our second full day on the island, and we're hoping to get our COVID test results back this morning. Our timeline for quarantine and arrival here on the island was we took our first COVID test on a Tuesday. We then flew across the country domestically in the United States on a Thursday. We arrived in Barbados on a Friday and checked into our hotel that day. We then got wristbands when we arrived that are blue. This indicates that we have not had our second COVID test yet. When we arrived at the hotel, we booked our follow-up COVID test for the following morning, Saturday. On Saturday morning, we took our second COVID test. We still had the blue wristbands, which means we were only allowed in the historic pool and not the other pools. That's pretty much the only restriction that we have, and we have the benefit of room service fees being waived. Today is Sunday, and we're expecting to get our COVID results back sometime this morning, probably before 10:30 a.m. We were told if we do not get them back by 10:30 a.m. that we can call and get the results directly. Once we have our results back, our wristbands should be changed from blue to green, and we'll get new wristbands and we'll be able to freely go anywhere around the resort as well as the rest of the island. While we have the blue wristbands, we're only allowed to stay on the resort. We cannot explore the rest of the island. We still need to continue our temperature checks for the following 5 days, and that is both in the morning and in the evening, and we need to do it for all members of our family traveling together.
So one of the nicest parts about staying at the Crane is even if you have a blue or a green wristband, whichever color it is, you can still walk around the resort. And so that means you can still walk to the general store, order outside of there, or go in if you have a green wristband. And it's just kind of nice to be able to get outside, walk around, and enjoy this beautiful place.
We got our test results back on Sunday, and they were negative, and I've never been so happy to fail a test in my life. So we got our bands changed from blue to green. Now that means we have access to anywhere in the resort. When we got our bands changed, they gave us some paperwork that shows that our second test on the island came back negative. So that way, if anyone from the Ministry of Health or the government asks, we can present documentation showing that we have a negative test on the island and we're not as much of a risk of spreading COVID here on the island. We are now allowed to eat out at restaurants on the property, which is wonderful because there are some lovely restaurants on this property. Now that we've received that paperwork that shows that we have a negative test on the island, we are allowed to leave the resort and go anywhere else that we would like in the entire country. That also means that we're now allowed to go to the beaches here, which is great because it's been so tantalizing seeing them off in the distance and not being able to go out onto them. So that's a step-by-step overview of the process of coming to Barbados during the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope this has been helpful, and if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments.